All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Analytical Whoopsies and Other Mishaps. With a title like that, any mistakes you see today are, of course, intentional. We're excited to present to you, and as always, we're grateful to Technion Data Solutions for hosting these webinars. Technion employs both Bridget and I, and we enjoy working here and helping clients with all kinds of data issues. Technion is a gold partner of Tableau and a partner of Alteryx as well. So if you have any data needs, Technion would be glad and happy to help you with those. Technion was the winner of the 2016 Services and Training Partner of the Year for Tableau, so that's exciting as well. Bridget and I will be presenting today. We're going to talk about various analytical mistakes, accidents, things that can happen when you're analyzing your data that can throw you for a loop. Bridget's going to maybe give you a little bit of a bigger picture of what we'll be looking at today, but I thought I would just jump right into what I like to call the very first thing that you need to worry about. So I've got Tableau here, and I've got a sample data set. I've got a data set of Starfleet officers. Yes, I know it's Star Trek again. Those of you who have seen these webinars before with me, you have already been warned about that. And as I look at this data set, I see a couple of different things right off. This data set's new to me, and so if I'm looking at it, I see, okay, we've got a Starfleet officer ID, we've got things like the ship and station name, highest achieved rank, and so I might start just by exploring the data set a little bit, or I may already have a question that I know I want to answer. In fact, I know that today what I want to do is I want to just look at how many officers have each rank. But I'll start just by looking at the officers themselves. So I'll take the ID, and I see that's just a normal ID field, and I look at the name. So these are very familiar names too, if you're familiar at all with Star Trek. We could probably do some analytics to determine who was the best captain or commander. I could tell you as well, but we'll leave it at that. And then I see here that I've got the highest achieved ranked by that individual, and that's what I'm most interested in today. So not so much the name or the ID, but I'm going to look at just the ranks, and I just want to know how many officers held that rank. So if I take my number of records and pull that over to columns, I get a nice bar chart, and I can see 5 captains, 3 admirals, 1 vice admiral, and that's actually pretty interesting. I might even want to go on and start to tell a story about the distribution of officer ranks in the Star Trek universe, and and I can start to make some observations, like we've had more captains than admirals, and the data set looks like it could have some interesting things to say. But one thing that I notice with this data set is that originally I had 5 individuals, and if I look at what I have here, I see that the sum of the number of records is 9, and that is a little bit concerning. Now, fortunately, this data set was small enough that I can see that. So if I went back, I can see here were the 5 individuals, and if I go forward, I see the total of 9. So fortunately, I can see that with such a small data set. But if you were working with a data set of hundreds or thousands or millions of records, quite likely something like this could slip by if you're not careful. And so what's going on here? Why am I getting more total here than I have total officers in the data set? Well, the reason is that I have something that I never looked at here, and that is the ship or station. And so if I look at that, I can see that some of these officers commanded more than one starship or space station. And that is giving me more records than I expected. When I saw the officer ID, my immediate assumption was, oh, that's my unique record. That identifies a unique record. But in fact, that's a bad assumption. And so what I like to tell people is, there is a question that you need to ask first with any data set that you're looking at. And with Tableau especially, what I tell people is, take that number of records, which Tableau is going to generate that for any data set that you have. Take that, drag that onto your view, see what you have. So now I know I've got 9 records, and so if I'd done this first and then I saw I had five individuals, I would have known immediately that that's not the number of officers. But then you have a question that you always need to ask. I have 9 what? 9 officers? 9 starships? 9 individual ranks? And that's the very first question that you have to ask for any data set. What is an individual record of data? What does it represent? Because until you know that, you are likely to make analytical mistakes and blunders all along the way. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a combination of fields that gives you a unique record. But you have to understand this first before you can do much meaningful analysis. Now, you can jump in and start to find out some things, but you're running a risk that you're going to not understand the data, what it represents, and you're not going to come away with good conclusions. So always ask that question first. And if you don't know, then go to the person who owns the data, try to find it out that way, ask other people. If it comes down to no one knows, or you have no way to find out other than just exploring, here's a way that you can find out what a unique record is. So I like to start with the record that I might think identifies a unique record, in this case an ID field. Then take that number of records field and just look at it. And if you see that you have any values of that dimension that you thought was a unique record identifier that have more than one record, now I know that officer ID does not give me a unique record. So I can start to look. And if I'm looking at a data set where I have maybe thousands of different values, it might be a little bit hard. I could sort things. But another thing I can do is I can copy this sum number of records to the filters, look at it by sum, and then let's just look at anything that is not a 1, so anything that's greater than 1. And now I can start to add in other fields until I find the one field or the combination of fields that eliminates everything, because now I know that that combination of fields identifies one record. And then I can start to take out fields because I realize, well, name doesn't really have anything to do with it, and rank really doesn't have anything to do with it. And I'll come down to the record or the combination that gives me a unique record, and then I know what my data set really is. So that's the first question to ask and answer when you start looking at data. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bridget, and she's got a few other questions and things that you should look at as you start to examine your data.
And Josh, thank you. That is, I definitely will say I use that tip a lot. The other tips I use, and as I kind of pull this together, so bear with me one moment, is looking at, okay, so now I've got the data, but then also just understanding the data and not making a few errors with the data. So unfortunately, I'm having some issues with PowerPoint, so you guys get this way. so what we've got is kind of a, hey, did you know? We've got things like we see statistics, and everyone's saying, okay, well, teen pregnancy, it drops after 20, but this is kind of a common sense conclusion. And so as you explore the data, you examine through the data, you're finding all these things. Sometimes you do run into these, but it's like, hey, what just happened here? You're so focused on the trend that you forget kind of this, hey, this isn't a teenager anymore. And so it's easy to get wrapped up in that. So you kind of go through your exploration. The other thing is, what in the world am I measuring? I really love these comics because it's like, okay, well, I'm measuring our relationship. Well, how do you measure that? What do you measure that on attention? Do you measure that on shopping? How is that measured? And so question those measures. And if you look at these, okay, well, I've got, these 5 measures. What do they really mean? So the other thing is, and I would say this is probably one of my favorites, is the mysterious indicator, especially if you're dealing with public data or you're working in an industry where you do a lot of calculations, and so you pull in these numbers. And it's what I call, not so scientifically, the, give me a moment, okay, test 1, 2, 3. So I've got where the data is kind of made in a vacuum. And I personally call this the Newton-Dyson effect. It's not a real rule, but it's just where, things happen in a vacuum and you don't really see it, you don't understand it. And so this is kind of the way of saying, okay, well, what is in that vacuum? Can you identify those indicators? Because sometimes you get just these indicators, but then what is really behind those indicators? So the more you can find out, the better. And then the other challenge is you're going along, you're making charts, and you've come up with, the X marks the spot. I have this conclusion. I see something really compelling here. What in the world is going on? Well, maybe these are, testing results by populations. Maybe this is just some type of measure by a population, and I should be averaging it, and instead I'm doing sum. So there are certain numbers that you don't want to sum, and maybe I've just made that mistake by dragging, dropping, moving through the data too quickly. So that is another way of kind of saying, okay, hey, I need to be more like the Lorax here and say, okay, I'm speaking for the numbers have no tongues, and I'm going to ask you at the top of my lungs, what in the world have you done with my data? So kind of keeping those in mind. The other thing is, am I measuring it right? So the question I sometimes get is, okay, well, statistically, do I use median? Do I use mode? And so being able to kind of say, okay, well, how do I measure this? And so an easy kind of rule of thumb is it skewed? If it's skewed, go with median. That's going to give you a better idea. So things like pay scales, things like testing results, things where you typically see a lot of high variance. Housing prices, another good one. The other thing is, can I add it? So if I'm adding things like sales or I'm adding things like profit, you're more likely to average those items than to use the median. And then finally, if you're in doubt, try using median. See, does that work versus using average? The final disclaimer here, I am not a statistician. So if you've got some really great local stats wonks, follow them, do whatever they tell you, and also give them gifts because they're brilliant and wonderful. So a couple of rules to keep in mind as you do this. At the end of the day, the answer is 42. That's the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And finally, don't panic. So if you do make one of these whoopsies, the beauty is it is easy to go back and fix. So that's kind of this PowerPoint, and then we'll actually move into some real examples of, okay, we've got this. The other challenge is, as Joshua kind of previously mentioned, is the data itself. A lot of times we get handed data in a particular structure. We get told, hey, this is clean data. And we go, great. And so now what we want to do is start averaging this, and using this data. You see where I've kind of paid attention. I said, okay, I'm going to average these items because these are TV ratings. I've got Nielsen data. And what I want to do is be able to compare, because I've got some of these groups where they go together and some of them where they don't. So if I try moving this around, I can't really do the type of analysis I want with the way the data is structured. Tableau in particular does very, very well with data that has what I consider to be more dimensions versus more measures. So right now I've got a data set that's very heavy on the number of measures and light on dimensions. So what happens is I end up with the dead-end dashboard. So I've got this very dead-end analysis. I can't do much. I really can't do too much with this. I can kind of move this stuff around. I can kind of try to play with this, but I don't really have a good way to kind of see these pieces and parts together. So I'll go ahead and jump through kind of a cleaner version. where I'm able to say, okay, well, here's this average quarter hour versus cum, which is total. And then I can kind of start comparing, okay, so I've got average quarter hour. I see these numbers are lower than these other numbers. But then I can begin saying, okay, well, I've got 12-year-olds, pretty much everybody versus I've got this segmented population. And I can see that whatever I'm displaying doesn't do as well with this target audience. So I can actually begin seeing my numbers just by changing the data. So that's kind of one quick example of where the data itself can also kind of encourage mishaps. So then the other mishap that we run into a lot is, okay, well, I've got the data, I'm analyzing the data, and I'm going to put it together, and I'm going to tell everybody, here's the data, you figure it out. And so we do this sometimes a lot, either when we're overwhelmed or we've just got all this data and we don't necessarily know how our end user is going to use it. So we just say, here's all this data, and we throw it out there. And it may be a good analysis to some extent, but it may not necessarily be as usable. So, I'm looking at school report cards. I'm trying to understand what's going on with testing. But maybe what I really want is to understand where I should send my child to school. Maybe that was really the question. So if I'm trying to figure out where I send my child to school, I don't have a good way to do this right now. So the other thing is really making sure that I've got a clear view of what it is I'm trying to do. And so my cheater way is I'll put the question down in the dashboard and say, okay, what is it that I am trying to answer? So, okay, let's look at what are the grades, going on with these assessments, kind of, who's above, who's below, kind of get a high-level summary, maybe at the grade level. Again, keeping in mind that I am constrained by the shape of the data as well. So then as I kind of move through this particular dashboard, I have a spot where I can say, okay, I have a child. My child is in 7th grade today. And what about my child? Well, my child's going to be female today. My child's going to be gifted. And my child is going to be in Adams County. And so that way I can begin to find the best school. And so as I kind of move through here and I've got the best school kind of picked and okay, I'm seeing kind of where my child would fall and what things would look like for me and for my child as well. And I can also kind of put in cues about, okay, maybe this particular thing isn't tested. Okay, so what about maybe 8th grade? And I can begin kind of exploring and understanding the data a little bit more. And then finally just being able to say, okay, well, here's all this information. Where, oh, where should I send my child, particularly if I know maybe math is not a strength. And so just building this and creating something usable is also very, very important. And having kind of that question in mind and avoiding kind of the whoopsie. So Joshua, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks. So let me switch the screen and all right. So when we think about the tasks of an analyst and the places where you could potentially make mistakes, a lot of what we want to look at today and what Bridget has already started to introduce is the concept of 3 basic areas. So we've got the data, we've got the investigation or the analysis of the data, and then we've got the storytelling. With the data itself, you've got some things that you've got to do as an analyst to avoid making mistakes. You've got to look at the data and understand what it is. What does a record of data indicate? You've also, like Bridget was saying, you've got to consider the shape of the data. Is the data shaped in such a way that's going to make your analysis easy or hard? Is it going to enable the analysis that you want? Those are things that you have to take care of up front. Now, it can be an iterative process. You can start to work with it and then realize, oh, it's not the right shape. I need to go back. So it's not that you have to get everything perfect up front, but you do have to have a solid foundation to start to build your analysis on. The second step, investigation. So this is where you're going to start to ask questions of the data, and you're going to start to analyze the data. And as Bridget was mentioning, there are pitfalls to avoid here as well. One is understanding what sorts of analysis you can do and what is valid. So is it valid to use average or mean or mode or some other statistical model? Do you understand the questions that you need to answer? Those are things that, that you'll have to understand. And then finally, storytelling, which we'll talk about in a bit and which has already been touched on briefly. Are you communicating the findings correctly? So you may have understood the data, you may have done your investigation, you may have done all of that flawlessly or at least corrected mistakes on the fly, and now you're ready to tell the story, but there are pitfalls to avoid there. Let's consider the investigation just a little bit. I have a couple of different data sets that I want to do some analysis, and I've got an idea of the analysis that I want to do. One is daily values, and the other is daily goals. Very simple data sets, just for simplicity and understanding the concept. But I'm going to do a little bit of due diligence. So I've already checked the number of records, and just to make sure, I'm going to just bring out my date here. I've got a date. I'm going to right-click, drag and drop. That lets me pick which part or value I want. Here, I'll just take the date as a discrete field, and then I'll just look at. Well, first I'll take the number of records, and just to confirm, I do have one record per date. So very simple data set, and what that record is just the sales value on that date. So I can look at the sales and see that I had certain sales on that date. I'm going to clear this sheet, and I'll check my my second source here, which is my daily goals. Very similar thing. If I look at this one and I look at date individually, I've got all the dates here. Number of records is 1 for every date. So no problems there. And then if I look at the goal, what I see is that I have a daily sales goal for each date, and it varies. So some days are less, some days are more. There seems to be maybe a weekly pattern here. If I did a little bit more investigation, I'd realize, okay, Saturdays I have a higher goal, Sundays I have a little bit less of a goal. And then weekdays are pretty constant, and then as I get into February, it looks like we kind of jump up to maybe $900 on a weekday as our goal. So nothing too complicated. I'm going to go ahead and clear the sheet one more time and switch back to the daily values. I'll start with this one, and what I want to do is I want to see my sales over time. So my sales for every date. Again, I'll right-click and drag and drop that date, this time on columns, and again, I'll look at it just at an individual date level. And then I'm going to take that date field one more time, right-click, drag and drop, and I'll drop it right in front. This time I'll select month. And so now I've got it sliced by month, I've got it sliced by day, and what I want to do is I want to see the cumulative total month by month, and then did that cumulative total meet my overall goal for the month. So both of my data sets are daily, but I can get there in a couple of different ways, and one way is just to use a quick table calculation. I've got a running total so I can see how things add up across time. If I switch that, instead of table across, we'll just use pane across, and that way I get the running total for each month, and I can see what the end of the month looked like, and then it'll start over. I might even want to show that on a label, so we'll show it on a label, and we don't need to see every mark, so maybe just the ends of the line, just to see kind of where we started and ended. And this is really nice. Now I can see, you know, day by day how we did and where we ended up at the end of the month. And now I can look at my daily goals. If I switch over here, I can see that I'm going to blend on date. That's fine. And I'm going to take my daily goal, and just for now, I'm just going to drop it here just on the detail of the marks card. And that way it'll show up as part of a tooltip. But I can see that every date I get my running total of sales, but I also see what that daily goal is. And I think to myself, well, I just want to see what the total for the month was. One easy way to do that is to add a reference line to that axis. So I can take that goal value, and not average, but sum, and per pane is great because that will give me the sum of that goal. Let's maybe even make that a little bit nicer as a custom so that I can see the goal and I can actually see what the value is. And at this point, I have done some good investigation of the data. I think that I've even got a great story to tell. I'm going to go to my boss and show her that that for the last couple of months that we have easily met our goal. In fact, January was great. We met our goal towards the end of the month, but we blew right past it. And then February, we still met the goal. You know, we were just barely over it. But I take this to her, I show it to her, and her response is, those goal values are too low. Those are not the goals that the board set. Your data's wrong, or you've done something wrong with the data. And I think to myself, how did I do something wrong? I mean, there was a little bit of complexity with some table calculations and data blending, but nothing that I thought was beyond what I was able to do. And I go back and I think, oh, there's something I should have checked. What should I have checked? Well, the very first thing I should have checked was I should have checked that secondary source all by itself without the blending. Because if I had done that, and I did check it, but I checked it at the day level, but what if I had looked at the daily goal value and I had looked at it by month? So we go down to the month level, and I see, oh, my total goals were 23,000, 22,000, and back here on my other chart, yeah, I was low. I had 18,000, 19,000. So what happened? Why are these values higher than these? Everything looks right. I check my blending. I'm blending on date. I'm getting the right field here, daily goals. The reference line should have added everything up correctly. What did I do wrong? What else should I have checked? Well, one thing you should always check, especially when you're doing blending, but also when you're doing other kinds of analysis, is do you have all the data that you think you have? So this kind of goes back to the data question, but in the course of investigation, I need to be sure that I'm not making any assumptions. So what if I look at this date as a continuous field? Notice there are gaps in the data. There are dates where I don't have any values. In fact, it's not just that I don't have values, it's I don't have a record for that date at all. And the problem with that is that, sure, I've got sales values for each one of these dates and no sales values. So when I do my cumulative total across the month of sales values, that's fine. But what about when I look at my daily goals and I bring those in? Well, I get all the daily goals for the records that exist in that primary source, but I'm missing the ones where there are gaps. So what this requires me to understand is the data, and specifically whether that data is dense or sparse. That is it dense in the fact that it has all the values, it has all the records for every possible value, or is it sparse, meaning that there are missing values? And then I might need to ask, is that valid? Is that invalid? Does that mean that the data is good or bad? But assuming that it's good, then I have to understand how Tableau works, or how whatever analytical tool I'm using works. And in this case, with data blending, it means I'm not going to get the values in the secondary source if they don't exist in the primary source. So that brings me back here, and it turns out there's a very easy solution, and that is Tableau has built in the ability to take that sparse data and densify it. So to add those missing values on the date field, on the drop-down, there's an option for show missing values. And the way data blending works is if I show the missing values in the primary source, then the secondary source gets to bring in all of its values, but now I've got a different story. Now that I've corrected my analytical mistake, I see, oh, we did meet the goal in January, but just barely, and we did not meet the goal in February. So be aware of the data itself, and as you start to do your analysis, be aware of what happens when your data is missing values, what happens when your data is a different shape, what happens when you use the tool and you're using specific features like data blending, what's the behavior of the tool? And this takes a little bit of knowledge on your part and a little bit of learning, but as you grow in your ability and as you grow in your knowledge, you'll start to understand how to avoid mistakes like this. And now I'll turn it back over to Bridget.
All right, thank you. So kind of along with that, it's really just figuring out what exactly we're trying to tell. And so trying to find that story. And that, especially as an analyst, can be very hard. There's sometimes a lot of fear to take ownership of the message. And so one thing is, as we kind of do our exploration, we start putting things together, is figuring out what it is that we've got to say and what it is our data itself has to say. Because sometimes we come in with this idea and this knowledge of, I want to tell a particular story. And so, for example, one of the dashboards I did is one on language. And I'm, I would say if I were known for a dashboard, it's probably either this one or another one. But these would be one of the ones. And so what I'm looking at is actually the first draft of a dashboard I put together where I kind of just focused on all these languages. And it was really kind of an explosion of knowledge. There was a lot in it. There was a lot of just, I see this, I see this. And so for somebody that's very intimate and knowledgeable about language, for me, this makes sense. But when I show it to others, it's almost overwhelming. There's a lot in it. There's a lot of very somewhat technical kind of jargon in some ways from a linguistic side, and just kind of the analysis itself is very, very centric on topics that may or may not be helpful to somebody not necessarily familiar with linguistics. And so as I kind of vetted this and got feedback, one of the things I heard is, okay, this is nice, but it's not helpful and it doesn't give me the information that I want. I'm curious about, some of these other things. And so I have a degree in American Sign Language, and that was the one thing I didn't focus on. I focused more on kind of languages in whole, and one of the questions I got was, well, what about sign languages? And it was like, So we do sometimes come at these with preconceived knowledge. We go through this journey, and so for somebody like me where I know a lot about sign language, I already know that every country has a sign language, and so I don't even think about it. I don't even think that others don't know that. And so we sometimes come in where we're focused more on something totally different because it's interesting to us, but very few people have either our depth of knowledge or the interest level of, that particular topic at the level that we're focused on. So when I redid this, and I pretty much redid this from scratch, the only few charts I kept were kind of the top ones and then the bottom one. And then a lot of this changed. And so we'll kind of go through a little bit of this where it's like, well, are we speaking the same language? But are we? And you look at kind of the languages, the country, you look at sign language, and you really see how many different sign languages there are. You can see we've got English, we've got American Sign Language at the top, you see French, and you see French is following, then you see Spanish is the top, the third top, and yet there we've got Russian. So we've got some variance and difference, and then it kind of just seems to go very differently from there. And sign language is not universal, and so we've kind of got this exploration and understanding where, different countries may only have, there's 67% of the languages are unique to a particular country. And so that kind of gives us an idea. we can kind of see about distinct languages. We can see kind of where things fall of, okay, these are the countries where there is no language that's unique to them. And so the pacing of this is even different. So as you kind of flow through, it's really segmented, it's slowed down, and some of the higher level details are removed. And then finally getting into where I can kind of pick my own adventure and figure out that, you know, American Sign Language is fairly widely used, and it's not necessarily used in all the places we would expect. So if you go to Mali, you will find American Sign Language signers. And if you go to kind of South Korea and other places, you'll actually find, you know, in the Philippines, American Sign Language. And that doesn't necessarily follow the pattern of English. So that's kind of another way where we ourselves, and we bring ourselves to the analysis, can affect the analysis. So just making sure, too, that we're thinking about the end user and how that person's going to use it, and not so much how we want to use it. So from a Six Sigma standpoint, they say that training is only 20% effective when it comes to making change, whereas if you change the form or you change the format, that tends to be about 80% effective. So really focusing on how do I make this clear for somebody else without training, without having to navigate them, and without having to explain it. So the more I can put myself in their shoes, the better. So that's kind of a quick run on just the other big analytical whoops, which is I assume everybody knows what I know. So go ahead, and Joshua, go ahead and turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Bridget. That's really good. What I've got is just maybe one last illustration of an analytical mistake that can lead you to tell a bad story. What I've got is I've got the Superstore sample data a little bit modified because what I've got here is I've actually got a store field, and so the goal that I have is to tell a story around how the stores are doing. And I have a specific metric in mind. I want to look at profit per customer by store. That is, how much profit does that store make per customer? Because I think that a really good store is going to have customers who spend a lot of money, and not just a lot of customers who spend a little bit of money. We could debate whether that's true or not, and that would be another analytical question that would be very valid to ask. But just for the sake of illustration, let's assume that that's a good question. I'm going to take a profit here, and we'll just check out profit first. So overall profit of the stores, we're looking pretty good. I don't have any unprofitable stores. I have some that are doing better than others, but overall we're doing pretty well. And so as I start to go from analysis into telling the story, I realize I'm going to need to calculate the profit per customer. And so I'm able to do that very easily in Tableau. I just build a calculation that takes the sum of my profit and divides by the distinct count of customers. Now here's a potential analytical blunder. That is, I am counting distinct on customer name, and as we know, different individuals can have the same name. So if my data set allowed for it, I would much prefer to use a customer ID field, some sort of a unique identifier, just to make sure I'm not counting two different people as the same individual. But again, for the sake of this illustration, we'll assume that customer name is valid, and that I can get a good count. Now there's no trick here. This is a valid calculation, profit per customer, so that looks great. And I'll use that. I'll bring that in here instead of some profit. And immediately something jumps out to me, and that is I've got a store that's doing really well. I've got some others that are doing pretty well, and then maybe some that aren't doing quite as well. But this is pretty amazing, because I've got some stores that are doing pretty well, and I'm going to start to structure this into a story to tell. So So I'm going to sort, and then I'm going to add some context to this story. Beyond just the data itself, I have some knowledge that I can bring to the table, and that is I know that we had a goal of $150 per customer. That was the goal that we wanted our stores to strive for. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add that as a reference line. It's a constant, and we'll call it 150, and we'll even give it a label. So $150 per customer was our goal, and so there's some context to the story. I might even start to really highlight what's going on here. So we've got this store here. I'm just going to click on group just as a quick way to color code that one and bring it to your attention to show you that store met the goal. In fact, I'm going to change the title here. In fact, store 11 was the only store to even meet the goal. And so now I've got a visualization that maybe is the start to a story. I might want to include this in a dashboard with other visualizations that bring out other aspects of that story. And there might be some other cleanup that I want to do here to make it even more presentable to my audience. But I think to myself that I've got a pretty compelling story here, and I think that it really is going to go a long way towards helping management understand what's going on, and maybe store 11 is going to get some promotions or bonuses. Some of the other stores did okay, but maybe some of them could use some work. So I'm feeling really pretty good about this story, and I've done my due diligence. I've checked the data. I mean, it's Superstore sample. I know that data set, so I understand that one, and I feel confident that the data is good. I've checked my calculations. It's good, but I've made a very serious mistake. And the mistake that I made was when I looked at profit per customer, the one thing that I never checked, I checked profit, but I never checked how many customers each store has. And so if I look at customer, so I'll take that customer name and I'll right-click and drag and drop it over here and do account distinct on customer name. And now you understand why store 11 has such a great looking profit per customer. Is because they only have a few customers. Now, maybe that is the goal. Maybe 50 customers is acceptable, and the fact that they spent a lot of money is good. But in fact, if I were to look only at this store and look at the customers, and let's take out the profit per customer in and of itself, and then look at the profit alone, and we'll do a sort, I realize it's not even just a few customers who spends a lot of money. It's one customer, maybe two, maybe three that spend a lot, and then a few more who didn't spend very much at all. And I'm not sure that that's an indicator of a healthy store. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not. And so my original story that I was so proud of and so happy to tell, turns out it's completely invalid. And it's because I made an analytical blunder. I assumed that something was significant. A measurement that I took, I thought had significance when truly it didn't. So always double check what you're measuring. Always double check that when you're looking at something, that it really is significant. Make sure that you have enough observations for your statistical model. Make sure that that averages and ratios look at the numerator and the denominator to make sure that what you're really getting is of true significance. So that's the data, the investigation, and the storytelling, and we've shown you some examples that are good. We've shown you some examples that are not, some pitfalls to avoid, some whoopsies and mistakes to avoid. Definitely not telling you to never make a mistake, because we all do. But when you make it, be quick to find it and correct it. So that's analytical whoopsies and mistakes. We'll open it up for questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes, and we even have a question already. So Michael asks, for the show missing dates example, how do you resolve the issue when the dates are at the beginning of the data set? For example, if January 1st through 3rd were missing, would Tableau populate these? So let's go back to that example. And in fact, that's a great example, because the truth is that no, Tableau, if I turn on the missing dates, it's only going to fill in the ones between the first and the last date in the data set. If there are dates that are missing at the beginning or the end, it's not going to fill in those. In fact, here, oops, the first date we have is January 2nd, so I'm missing January 1st to begin with, which means that even this isn't right. That goal number should be a little bit higher. So that's a great point, a good thing to understand. So how do you deal with that? Well, once you've identified that that's an issue and you see that you're missing dates at the beginning or the end, you've got a couple of different options. You can either add those dates to that primary data set, and you can do that in various different ways. If your data is stored on a database server, you can actually go add those records with null values for everything else, and that would be enough for Tableau. Now that you have the option for cross-database joins, you can actually join in your full set of dates and fill them out that way. So there are definitely options, but that's a great thing to be aware of, is that the built-in feature of show missing values will only show what's in between, and even that is based on your filter. So if you're filtering to a certain set of dates, then whatever that filter gives you as your first and last value, you're only going to get the dates in between. So great question there. And Bridget, feel free to jump in on any of these, but we've got another question from Robert, who says, great sessions. Thank you, Robert. And he says, what's the best way to resolve significant outliers to normalize your analysis?
So for me, one of the ways I've done that in the past is visually. For example, things like box plots are a good way to kind of highlight that there are outliers. Generally, there's a risk when you exclude it. If you exclude it, you want to at least let people know that you have excluded it and kind of give them perspective. I mean, I've done charts before where it's like, here's the whole picture. You can see where this one stands, how much of an outlier it is, and then here's this more in focus. So that's one way I've handled where I've got all these outliers. The other way is parameter switching, where you can basically say, okay, here is with outliers, without outliers, but just making sure that you do communicate that they exist. Again, depending on your business, that could really have significant ramifications. So that would be kind of my take. Joshua, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. It's essential to communicate what you're doing with the data, and it may be showing it, or at the very least adding some sort of an annotation or note saying, you know, two stores were excluded from analysis, and giving a reason why. But you want to be truthful and transparent with your audience, not hide things that are changing the story. That has a potential for adding a lot of bias and giving you control over how things end up, that if you're not careful, could lead you to miscommunicate something. So I totally agree with that. If it's an outlier that's a data issue, that might be a slightly different situation. So if the data is bad and that gives you an outlier, that's a little bit different than if it's true values and you feel like you know the reason why and it's not significant to your analysis. Then okay, exclude them, but definitely communicate it. All right, maybe another 30 seconds to see if any more questions come through. And as soon as I said 30 seconds, I realized that's an uncomfortable length of time to sit in silence. So maybe we won't do 30 seconds. If you're in the middle of typing something, then go quickly. I'll keep an eye on it as I wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It is truly a pleasure to present. We love it, and we love the fact that that we've got an audience, and we love the fact that that you give us great feedback. If there's ever any way that that you think these webinars could be more useful or more helpful, or things that we can improve, we'd love to hear that as well. Feel free to reach out to either Bridget or I. There's our Twitter handles at least. Feel free to reach out to Technion if you have any data needs. If you'd love to have a consultant come and look at your data and work through analysis to see if there are any analytical whoopsies or other mishaps going on, we'd love to do that as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next time.